du débat. Resuming debate, the honourable member for Calgary Centre.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. And I rise today in response, of course, to Bill C-3 and the ability to speak upon it. It is initially introduced as Bill 337 in 2017 by Rona Ambrose, who was the leader of the Conservative Party at that point in time, and has doggedly pursued this, even though she is no longer in the House of Commons. And we have to give her all the credit in the world for that, because this is a very important bill. This bill comes to us for the third time, and that's a shame. The reason it's here again is because this government that initially put it through the paces of the Justice Committee in the last Parliament decided to end that Parliament without really good reason. I'm not sure when you end a Parliament how you actually decide to keep the good things and throw out the bad things. You throw out everything. So there was a process here we were going through, and this government decided to end that process on so many good things that had to happen with this country. This is one of those bills. Now we're starting over again. And that is a shame, considering how important this legislation is. As I said, I was on the Justice Committee in the last Parliament. I'm not on that Justice Committee anymore. However, we heard so many good reasons for this bill. Those good reasons came from so many interested parties that appeared before the committee. And Madam Speaker, if I could just go through some of those wonderful organizations that presented us such compelling evidence about why we need to proceed with this legislation. We heard from the Canadian Association of Black Lawyers. We heard from the Canadian Centre for Gender and Sexual Diversity. We heard from the Disabled Women's Network of Canada. We heard from the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund, the Canadian Centre for Child Protection, Colchester Sexual Assault Centre, Kawartha Sexual Assault Centre. Pardon me, Madam Speaker. And we heard from the Canadian Judicial Council. Now, these were almost unanimous. And I say, I'm not somebody who buys into groupthink. I think none of us are. We have to do our own analysis on what comes before us. So there was only one dissenting voice in that group of presenters about how important this legislation was for advancing the needs of women who had been through sexual assault hearings in front of our judiciary. And that one dissenting voice was the Canadian Judicial Centre. And representing lawyers there saying, we don't think the government should put their hands in our business because we have our own process and we're smart enough to take care of our own laundry. Well, Madam Speaker, I can tell you that no, that is not true. And this is our only venue here to actually have some influence on how we appoint judges and what's important in their job and how we can get their job done, because we know that once they're judges, they can actually, they no longer have the influence of Parliament. It is a separate part of our democracy, having an independent judicial system, and we want and we need to maintain that. Now, having a separate judiciary means we have to have a good judiciary. So having somebody appointed as a judge going through a certain process where it is evident from all the statistics we've heard about what happens in sexual assault cases that come before the judiciary, this is not something that can keep going on. To try and impose an actual education system for these people that we're appointing on these benches is our main instrument to try and influence them and how they view those victims when they're coming before them and giving testimony. That is what our role here is. We need to influence that legislation and make sure that these people we're appointing are well educated on what they have to do and make sure that they understand the needs of the victims, who they have to consider their rights as well. And I appreciate the legal system, Madam Speaker, as much as anybody else. You know, I'm not a legally trained individual, but in my previous employ, I had many dealings with the legal system. And seeing the legal system work, as you say, it's kind of like almost like Parliament here. You know, watching sausages get made, it's never pretty. And sometimes when you go through the legal system, you recognize what's happening here is not perfect. It might be one of the best systems in the world as far as the judicial hearings go, but at the same time, You look at faulty outcomes. You look at judges that make decisions, and you sit back and scratch your head. And now, how on earth did that person make that decision, given everything we've heard in this hearing today? That is troubling as a rational person, but nevertheless, it is reality. And as one of my colleagues said earlier here, we're all human. In this House of Commons, we're all human, and we're not supposed to be perfect here. Judges are the same. We appoint judges. We don't expect them to be perfect. We expect them to do the best job they can with the information that's presented to them, and hopefully we have the best outcome for society at the end of the day. But the statistics we've heard clearly show that we're not getting the best outcome for society on what we're doing now, so change is important, and that's why we're here. We're here to make sure that change that we're imposing upon the appointment of judges happens very well. The Justice Committee was one thing, but let me tell you about the actual hearings themselves. That we got to hear about women that were not represented in that case. They would come before the judges, and they felt belittled in the process. This is an important change for society to make sure that people that are victims of crimes have the ability to be heard, and to be heard effectively, because justice needs to be understood by the public for it to be an enforceable system. If we don't have a system that is open to everybody that feels they're a victim of a crime, that feels that they're marginalized and should not come forward and present that crime to our society, then we have failed as a society. And that's our job here again, to make sure that we build on that going forward and get this better at the next iteration. Shutting down Parliament obviously had that effect of stopping that process. Stopping that process, now we're starting again. How long is this going to take before we actually get some legislation that matters to Canadians? Small bits, small advances, we all know that. And there's been so much going on here, so much that's been thrown out, the baby with the bathwater as we've gone through this. But it is the result of a government that has no regard for what we're doing here as far as process goes. And process means examining legislation and making sure, as much as possible, we get it right. So getting it right, it means putting the right bills in front of us, getting those bills heard through the process that's been developed over years and years and years, and then we get to analyze what's right, what might be wrong with that, hear the expert opinions that come through that, and come to a conclusion about the best path forward. That isn't here right now. When you shut down Parliament in the middle of a pandemic, the government effectively said, we don't respect this process. We want our own process that we don't have to deal with other people. So therefore, we've got to make sure that this is held in account. I'm dismayed, Madam Speaker, that this is before us again. I wish this wasn't here. I wish this had already received the third reading from this House and been over to the other House and would be getting debated there so we could move it towards royal assent once and for all. But it's been held up too many times and prorogued and left to die on the order paper, and Parliament closed. Finally, can you get some work done, get Parliament working again? And thank you, Madam Speaker.
Questions et commentaires, questions and comments. The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker. And I thank the member from Calgary Centre for his contribution to today's discussion. I want to invite him to perhaps correct the record in reference to some statements that were made in the last 20 minutes by his colleague, the member from Medicine Hat, Cardston Warner. I'm going to read to him something. The quote is, "They have an opportunity to show they put victims of sexual assault and women's issues before political games," end quote. That's a citation from Rona Ambrose, a woman whose name has been invoked repeatedly on both sides of the aisle in the context of this debate. And that's a comment she made in reference to Conservative senators in the last Parliament blocking Bill 337 from securing passage and royal assent. And that is a statement she delivered to the National Post on June of 2019. The member from Medicine Hat, Cardston Warner, clearly attempted to portray the prevention of receiving royal assent on that important piece of legislation on the fault of the government, the Liberal government. I invite the member from Calgary Centre to correct the record and clearly indicate what Ms. Ambrose had said, which is that, in fact, the obstacle was put in place by members of his own caucus. Thank you.
The honourable member for Calgary Centre.
As you know, Madam Speaker, I've been a member of this House since October of 2019, and it's an honour to serve the residents of Calgary Centre, and I'm pleased that they chose me to represent their interests. The advancement of this issue is very important. I'm elected to this House. I'm not elected to the Senate. My colleagues on this side of the House have been unanimous in support of this bill, and we continue to be unanimous in moving this bill forward. So, Madam Speaker, thank you. I'm unaware of the actual quotations that my member on the other side of the House has brought forth here, but thank you.
The commentaires, questions and comments. The honourable member for Sherwood Park for Saskatchewan.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank my colleague for his speech. I do want to just take this opportunity to respond to what the Parliament Secretary said, because I was here in the last Parliament, and what we saw, frankly, from the government was an effort on their part to push through large government bills that were widely opposed across the country, bills like C-48 and C-69, which I know the member who just spoke knows well as our shadow minister working on natural resource issues. But the point is that the government was trying to rush through those very bad bills, but government bills, through the Senate, and there was a backlog of private members' business. And if that affected many good private members' bills. It affected an organ harvesting bill that I had done a great deal of work on as well. But the fact is, the Senate rules involve prioritizing government legislation, and if the government had done a little better job, frankly, of listening to people and listening to the legitimate concerns raised about Bill C-48, Bill C-69, maybe the process would have been smoother on those bills, and there would have been more time in the Senate to get to other things. But the government's kicking Liberal senators out of their caucus so they have no capacity to engage the agenda in the Senate. That was a decision they made, and they're blaming other people for their inability to manage their own legislative agenda.
Does the member from Calgary Centre have a comment back?
Thank you, and I appreciate the question from my colleague. Madam Speaker, it's exactly the reason that many of us ran for this Parliament. We saw the way the government was rushing certain legislation through the House and through the Senate with no regard for process and what Canadians actually needed in that process. That happened, and obviously there was a selective process applied about which of those bills were good for them at that point in time and how much time was being spent on them, and some good bills got left in the trash. And unfortunately, the predecessor to this bill was one of the ones they chose to leave behind. Now, why you choose to advance bills that divide Canadians and don't move us forward socially, and leave the ones that are actually unifying us all as we come to debate them, is a question that's up in the air for many people across Canada. And I would challenge the government to actually take a look at what their priorities are as far as the social issues like this one, and also the economic issues that are facing Canada. Thank you.
Commentaire. L'honorable député de Longueuil-Saint-Hubert.
The honourable member for Longueuil-Saint-Hubert. A very brief question. Well, a question then. For 2 days now, and as I said earlier, I deplore the fact that the two parties are saying it's your fault, it's their fault, and whatnot. If we'd sent the issue to the SEDA, it would be adopted already. And if it didn't exist, rather, it could be adopted already. I'm voting on a fundamental issue for society. That's what this is about. But there are people here. Well, I had to go out and put my face on signs and get elected. But in the Senate, people aren't elected.
Député de Calgary West, une réponse très rapide.
Je remercie mon collègue.
Well, I'd like to thank my colleague from the bloc, Madam Speaker, for his comments. I don't disagree with them. Our work here is to debate subjects, topics. And with respect to the other place, well, that's not our business here. This is just all part of our process. Thank you.